Okay. All right, let's go ahead. First of all, let me say thank you to Scott and Kathryn for organizing this. I'm going to try to explain why you ought to care about what's going on now, both in Ukraine and the Russian conflict, the Russian war on Ukraine. I care. I lived in Kyiv for 3 years. The thought of the Russian military going into that beautiful city horrifies me. But it's 5,000 miles away from here. So why should Americans care, especially when the big challenge is China and the Indo-Pacific region? So let me give you some reasons. Back in the early 1990s, we were asked at one point, I was on the National Security Council in 1995. I had just replaced Rose. And we were asked to come up with a one-sentence description. What is the US interest in Ukraine? What's our vision for Ukraine? And the sentence we came up with was, we want to see Ukraine develop as an independent, stable, democratic state with a robust market economy and growing links with the West. And that's because that kind of Ukraine was in the American interest. And I would argue that vision held not only for the Clinton administration, it also held for the George W. Bush administration, it held for the Obama administration, and with the exception of President Trump, it was the vision also for most of the Trump administration. And going on, so several reasons. I mean, first of all, there was kind of the basic reason, which if you have a successful Ukraine, that contributes to a more stable and secure Europe. And that's been an American interest going back to the end of World War II. On the other hand, if Ukraine is weak and unstable, that's going to cause problems to countries that we care about in Central and Eastern Europe. Second, Ukraine, we thought, and Ukraine proved itself a good partner on issues of importance to the United States. So in 1998, for example, when the United States was trying to block the nuclear power plant that the Russians were building at the world's third largest nuclear plant, that included something like 175 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 45 strategic bombers, and about 1,900 strategic nuclear weapons designed, built, and deployed to strike the United States. And in 1994, Ukraine agreed to give those up for elimination. Now, related to that would be my next reason is, why should we care? We told the Ukrainians that we would care. Part of the arrangement under which Ukraine agreed to give up nuclear weapons was the receipt of security assurances. They were previewed in January of 1994 in the trilateral statement. Then they were in the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. And in that document, the United States, Russia, and Britain committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, its independence, and committed not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine. Now, this was the Memorandum on Security Assurances, not guarantees, and that's an important distinction. We told the Ukrainians we cannot say guarantees because to American ears, guarantees means what a NATO ally has. And we're not prepared to say now, in 1994, that we are prepared to commit American military force to Ukraine if there's a violation. But we did say assurance means we're going to take an interest and we're going to care. Now, of course, particularly over the last 8 years, the Russians have shredded all of their commitments under the memorandum. I think that calls for an American response. There are some who have argued that, in fact, the United States really doesn't need to do anything more under the Budapest Memorandum. They say, well, we didn't invade Ukraine. We respect their sovereignty. But I disagree because in the run-up to both the trilateral statement and the Budapest Memorandum, we said certain things to the Ukrainians. Again, we said we will take an interest, that there will be an American response should the Russians violate these commitments. Now, we did not get into detail back in 1993 or 1994 exactly as to what the United States would do. And that was in part because we, and here I'm talking about the collective we on the American side and we, our counterparts on the Ukrainian side, were dealing with Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had lots of flaws, but he respected Ukraine's territorial integrity. He agreed that Crimea was a part of Ukraine. What we failed to foresee back in 1994 was Vladimir Putin and what happened in 2014 or what's happening now in 2022. And therefore, so we didn't have the conversation what exactly we would do. But I look at the Budapest Memorandum and I look at it in terms of back in 1994, we wrote Ukraine a check. We basically said, we care because you're doing something that was, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, was probably the #1 US objective with regard to the post-Soviet space after the breakup was not to have multiple nuclear weapon states. We said, we will care. And we wrote that check, hoping it would never be cashed. But Vladimir Putin now has required that it be cashed. A couple of other reasons I think it's important for the United States to be involved here. One is helping Russia or helping Ukraine resist Russia, because what you have is an unprovoked attack. Ukraine posed no threat whatsoever to Russia. And you really have to ask the question, is this acceptable behavior by a major power in the 21st century in Europe? And I would not want Russia to be able to conduct what they're doing now and somehow believe that they can get away with it or get away with it with minimal costs, because that may then lead to greater ambitions on the part of Moscow. And if some of those ambitions look elsewhere in what used to be the post-Soviet states space, you're talking about the Baltic states, and the Baltic states actually do have an American guarantee under NATO. So I do think that there is a lot of value for the United States in helping the Ukrainians resist the Russians now. And finally, I'll just manage one last observation, and it gets back to, again, the big strategic challenge for the next several decades being China. Other countries are watching how we handle this. And it seems to me that those include China first and foremost. And to the extent that the United States can manage a strong response that is backed by allies and partners, that's probably not a bad message to be sending to Beijing.
Thank you so much, Scott, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today on this somber day. It's been a very somber and difficult week, I know, for all of us who care about Ukraine and who care about the defense of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and the rule of law. Steve indicated that he and I have worked quite closely together over the years. There may be a good number of questions about the history of the Budapest Memorandum. I too was working on those negotiations, and Steve and I, in fact, were following each other around in various government jobs for quite a long time. So we will be happy, I'm sure. Well, I'll be happy anyway, Steve, but we can talk more about that history during the Q&A period. What I wanted to do with my remarks was talk a bit about the nuclear saber rattling that's going on, because it's been extremely concerning. I've been getting a lot of questions from the media about what's going on. And so I thought I'd use my introductory remarks just to lay those out on the table. Again, we can talk more about it. But first of all, I want to underscore the seriousness of this matter. We've all been watching Putin over the last several months, as he has kept his cards very close to his chest. And nobody could guess what was going on inside his head. But he said, that he was going to be very serious about these demands, as he calls them, for security guarantees from the West, related to the demilitarization of Ukraine, related to actually rolling back the borders of NATO to the 1997 borders, and ensuring that offensive forces are not deployed forward in Ukraine. So one can see that this invasion, 5-day-old invasion, sprang from his anger that his security guarantees, were not met by the Western Alliance nor by Ukraine. And so I take his threats seriously. But I also wanted to place his nuclear saber rattling in a bit of context, because Vladimir Putin was born in 1952. He remembers the period of the 1960s and 70s when actually this kind of nuclear, playing with nuclear alert levels was rather not, I wouldn't say popular, but it happened several times. The United States, for example, during the Mideast wars, the Yom Kippur War, for example, raised its alert level to DEFCON 3. There were responses from the Russian side. The Chinese at some point raised their alert level. The Israelis raised their alert level. So I'm not saying that this should be normal or acceptable as a matter of policy making or national policy, but there are these historical precedents, which I think is probably part of what's in Vladimir Putin's mind as he is making these decisions. For some time now, he has tended to play much more fast and loose with talk about nuclear weapons and the ability of the Russian nuclear arsenal to pulverize the opposition. He's been doing it now for some time, and in fact claimed at the time that Crimea was invaded in 2014 that he raised the nuclear alert level at that time, although not much was made of it, as there's being a lot made of it right now. I do want to underscore that I consider this a dangerous moment. It is an egregious, I would say, use of what should be a stable deterrent And indeed, the Russian Federation, not so very long ago in December, it seems like an eon ago, but in December signed with the permanent members of the UN Security Council, the 5 nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed a statement first made by President Gorbachev and President Reagan that nuclear war cannot be won, and therefore nuclear war should never be fought. And this is a statement that was at the time in December taken as a great victory as we're heading into the NPT review conference now scheduled in August. That's going to be a very difficult conference after all that has happened. But as we head into that NPT review conference, to have the P5, the nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, firmly signing up to this important declaratory statement. And now, Putin seems to have thrown it out. And so I do know that today the White House has reminded him of that statement. I think that's an important step that they took. I also wanted to remark on how the United States has been responding, as well as NATO allies, UK and France. I have been glad to see the measured and serious way that they are responding, but they are not doing so in any manner that could be considered escalatory. The president and the United States government have been very explicit that we are not changing the status of our nuclear forces. We see no reason to do so. That, to my mind, is a very wise course. It's a good way to go. And furthermore, they are being very tough on Putin, but they're not really emphasizing this at the highest level. The president, of course, has made some remarks, but you may have noticed over the weekend, they sent the ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Greenfield, out to make the remarks about this is a very serious and dangerous step to take. I think that is right, not to drive it to the highest level at every moment. The president, of course, must opine publicly, but this should not be a public debate of some kind between Biden and Putin or any other leader. Let's see. I think I'll leave it at that. I do think that the U.S. response has been very measured so far and correct. It has had, I hope, the correct deterrent effect. The final point I'll make is that the Pentagon has announced today that they have not noticed any obvious changes in the status of the Russian nuclear forces. No obvious change in so-called muscle movements, as is Pentagon speak. I don't know if we can take much of comfort from that, however, because as you probably know, if you've studied this matter, our intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine launched ballistic missiles in any event are on very high alert and could launch within a very short period of time. So, but nevertheless, I know they are watching very closely, for example, to see if the Russians remove non-strategic nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons from their storage bases and move them to operational bases. And as far as I can tell, again, this is just based on what the Pentagon has said. They haven't seen those kinds of movements if there has been no muscle movement on the Russian side. So it's a somber, serious issue. And I believe the USG is handling it correctly, along with the UK and France. And we're just going to have to keep a very sharp eye on what is going on in Russia with the nuclear forces.
Thank you, Rose. Andriy.
Thanks.
Maybe you want to start about what main messages I getting during 5 days, last 5 days. In KU, we exist some special municipal application about different alerts, different news announcements, and so on. And the last 5 days, every about 2 hours, I getting message about air alerts, air alarm. And if you, I believe that all of you saw by TV what happens in Ukraine, and it's not important to talking about a lot about what happens, but maybe it's important to understand what main target for the Russia forces, for the Russian invaders. If you believe for Russia propaganda, for Russia President Putin, that the main target is military objects, but if you see what happens in the street of Ukrainian cities, you can see that it's not true. Putin's, and as always, Russians lie. It's, if you study Russia history, you know that every agreement, agreements with Russians, you must understand that they lie, whole their life. And this war also not, unfortunately, some exceptions. So they say that main targets, it's a military object, but they destroy cinema, hospital, schools, residential blocks, and unfortunately, they start massive attack to the to the civilian part of Kharkiv, Ochtyrka, Chernihiv, and a lot of another cities. And if we're talking about what happens in Ukraine, then you need to understand that it began civilian catastrophe of civilian people when they start a target to the military action, not Ukrainian army. And of course, when we're talking about the reason of war, and if you listen what Putin say in their speech, it sounds like, I don't know, I have, it's like only one non-diplomatic, very non-diplomatic, how to explain what they say. It's completely bullshit. So, you know, it's no sentence what he say, it's not true. And he mentioned, but if you try to analyze this organics, you understand that he wants to renovate past. He won't come back Ukraine to past. And it's look like that we have war when in one hand we have past, and past try to fight with future. And when we ask themselves why is important, because Ukraine is an example of maybe not ideal transformation, but very dynamic and live transformation when all these reforms, changes, they based on the willing of people, of the what people want to do, how they negotiate between themselves. Of course, we have a lot of difficult questions between, but it's all our domestic questions, and we move on like Ukraine, like state, like society. We moving forward maybe not very quickly, but we're moving forward. It's very important. But it's not only about some civilian catastrophe, it's also about ecological catastrophe. If you look to the screen of TVs, you can see how the Russian military shelling to the oil and gas station. They occupied Chernobyl nuclear station, what is stupid action because it's only nuclear trash, but it's really nuclear trash, and nobody knows what happened inside. And if some of brave Russia soldiers try to put some bombs, it will be new catastrophe. Another part of Ukraine, south of Ukraine, except Chernobyl nuclear power plant, we have a lot of other in near Rivne, near Khmelnytsky, near Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia is like a south part of Ukraine, and Russia troops coming from south, from Crimea, from occupied Crimea to Zaporizhia, and it's a dangerous situation when somebody stupid Russia soldier puts some grats or some start shelling Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and nobody knows what happens then. And another question is a food supply crisis, because Ukraine, it's important country what produce a lot of foods, not for our states, but also for Africa, for Middle East, for Central Asia. And if we not start our agricultural season at this year, have every year, what happens to the world? Not only for Ukraine, not only for our society. And of course, another question is when you're talking what happens and what we need to do and why it's important. It's also that Putin tried to involve another countries to the war. And Belarus today, it's those countries. Without Belarus, this war, this invasion, it will be impossible, because all main troops what now try to fight against Kyiv, they all come from Belarus. The most of the Russia aircraft coming from Belarus, not from Russia. and it's also a question to United States, to the West, to the whole world, how to deal with country who want to renovate nuclear weapon. I mean, Belarus. Who is next? And of course, question when we're talking about war, it's a question about future. If we lose, I hope not, but try to imagine if we lose, it's next question. So question is will be who is next? Poland, Finland, I don't know, Georgia, Baltic states. You can say about some space for preserve themselves from NATO countries, but Baltic states in NATO countries. It's a direct. So it's not neutral country. So when we're talking about today about Russia war against Ukraine, so we also need to understand that this war started in 2014 after our last revolution, because Putin he wants to catch Ukraine to the Russia or Soviet Empire, and they believe that all Ukrainians are Russians, but unfortunately, Russian soldiers cannot say Ukrainian word correctly. They don't understand what we say in Ukrainians, how we can one nation or one culture or something else. So maybe I stopped at this very short speaking, but it's a lot question not about Ukraine. It's also about our region and whole world. And if today Putin not be stopped, another regimes, another countries will be understand that they can use nuclear weapon to, and they use another country like a blackmail to do what they want. So it's a question about our common, our joint future. Thanks.
Kathryn, you're last, and then we'll go into, I'll ask a question or two, and then we'll open it up.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, yeah. All right, well, thank you very much. And it's those are three very hard acts to follow. My task is to try and flesh out some of the Russian thinking. And I'm not going to pretend to be in the mind of Vladimir Putin, but I think he's told us a lot, and a couple of the other speakers have talked about the speech that he gave that kicked this off last Monday. And I think there is where he gave us some clues about what he wants to do and his bizarre interpretation of Russian-Ukrainian history. And as Andriy just said, he thinks of Russia and Ukraine as one people. The problem is, of course, Ukrainians don't think of them that way, and have established themselves for the last 30 years as an independent country, and even before that, we're an independent country under 1917 to 1920. We can go further back. The question is, where do you go in history? And Mr. Putin has decided to go about 1,000 years or so to establish Russia's more right to Ukraine. But there is also an interesting article I tweeted out in Sputnik today that was in Sputnik that goes a little further. And that is talking about the goal of the reunification of Russia. And that includes Belarus and Ukraine with Russia, and that this is a natural historical fact that is they are part of the Russian Empire. And so note, as Andriy said, this war couldn't have taken place without Belarus's complicity and the complicity of their dictator, Alexander Lukashenko. He has also said he will be sending in forces into Ukraine. You might remember that he lost an election in August of 2020, and this has consequences. He stole the election. He stayed in office, and we have had the legitimate ruler of or elected president of Belarus here at Stanford, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. So this matters, that there is an opposition outside the country, that there is a legitimate government, and it matters that we didn't push back hard enough, evidently, on Belarus. Lukashenko is now completely dependent on Putin. He is now going to be folded into this greater Russia that Putin envisions. There's language like the Anglo-Saxons are dominating. I mean, it is a contra, yeah, it's a weird contra sort of, Anglo-Saxon world. He views himself as getting rid of an anti-Russian Ukraine. And this is important because it is in his mind, and you can just read this in the articles that are allowed to be put out. This is a Western constructed regime, this democracy of Ukraine's, doesn't think that people can do this themselves. These things don't happen organically, they are managed, right? And so people don't come out onto the streets themselves, they are paid, they are managed. And so the Ukrainian people themselves should have, by this logic, as little Russians, come out onto the streets and be handing bouquets instead of throwing Molotov cocktails at Russian soldiers. And so there has to be a little bit of a surprise that that is what's happening, the Molotov cocktails, that is, and not the bouquets, because Ukrainians have had an active civil society, active democracy for, since the initial Orange Revolution in 2004. But I would say that Mr. Putin has been planning this for years, and Russia's resurrection, if you will, for years. He's socked away reserves of $650 billion, one of the largest reserves fund foreign reserve fund in the world. We have now sanctioned that, and about 70% of it is held outside of Russia. So we've hurt, in terms of what have the sanctions done? Well, we've hurt the war chest that way. He has rebuilt the military since 2008, and Russia's sort of poor performance of the Russian military against Georgia, the Georgian military, when he invaded Abkhazia and South Ossetia there and occupies it. And then they've worked to spread influence abroad with a message of sort of a conservative Christian Orthodox message that is against Western small L liberalism and the over permissive West. And this has resonated in some parts of the world. They have used soft power, although I've had this debate with Joe, well, not a debate because we agree, this conversation with Joe Nye, that the Russians try to wage peace, wage friendship. So using things like RT, Russia Today, or Sputnik, to demonstrate, the Russian perspective and present an alternative perspective to the West. And so the goal here is to create a multipolar world where Russia and China are two poles in the tent against the United States and maybe Europe, that they have a different view of the world, which is that people need to be managed and controlled, and they work for the state. The state doesn't work for them. So if the state doesn't work for people, who does it work for? Well, it works for, there's a natural, if he is a slave to the state, as he's called himself, Putin that is, then he should get some payback from the state. And so there might be some self-enrichment here and there. He may have made some money, handed out contracts, skimmed off the top, but hey, sure, that's a natural thing. You should be paid for that. So this is how they can kind of justify this. The other thing is we look at what else has happened in the last couple of years in preparation for this. Let's look inside Russia. So what happened in August of 2020, Alexei Navalny, one of the leading opposition figures in Russia, was poisoned by the state, right? We know this. Navalny has even interviewed and posted on YouTube his phone conversation with one of the guys who perpetrated the crime. Navalny was pretending to be someone from the FSB calling the Russian security services, and the guy went for it. So we know that happened. While he was recovering in Germany, he was breaking the probation requirements of his his probation from a trumped up charge on corruption. And he didn't report in while he was in a coma to his probation officer. Literally, that's what he was arrested for when he returned bravely to Russia in January of 2021 and was immediately jailed. His organization then released a video of his palace on the Black Sea. There are more videos like that, by the way. Yes, Putin's palace. We watch them in my class, just saying, coming up in the spring quarter, if you really want to know stuff. So, you know, what to do with Navalny, keep him in jail, declare his organization a terrorist organization. In December of 2021, banned Memorial, which was one of the earliest human rights organizations in Russia that documented crimes of Stalinism, but it also had a human rights arm. He has gutted civil society. He has made them, sometimes you might see in Twitter, Russian NGOs or newspapers have to identify themselves as foreign agents. That comes with a whole bunch of reporting laws. And so, you know, if you remember in his speech last Monday, one of his complaints against Ukraine was they had NGOs, which he views as bad, right? This has to be Western influence. Again, people can't organize spontaneously. They have to be organized by, you know, foreign illicit actors. He views Ukraine as anti-Russian under this corrupt government, as he's called it, of Zelensky, of what are they, drug addicts and Nazis, right? Drug addicted Nazi leaders, which is ironic for a man of a Jewish descent, Zelensky. He interprets pro-democracy, pro-EU, that is Putin, as anti-Russian, inherently anti-Russian. And so what he thinks he's doing, and you can see this in the articles that Russians are reading, or at least are being printed there, who knows if they're reading them, is that he is freeing, he is liberating Ukrainians from these Nazis and addicted drug addicts. Inside the Russian Federation, what's going on, and I'll just stop with this. So we've put some personal sanctions on people, individual sanctions on very rich people. And we should clarify that the oligarchs of the 1990s are not the very rich people around Putin. They're different. And the oligarchs under Yeltsin would more or less, you know, be able to heavily influence politics and policy around him. That's not the case here. These are all people, the people around him who we've sanctioned mostly, although we have sanctioned other really wealthy people too, are appointed by him to run, for example, Rosneft or Gazprom or other oil companies, aluminum, diamonds. Russia sells all kinds of things like that. And so we have also sanctioned them, but it's important to know Putin has known them for decades, right? He put them in those positions. So hopefully the sanctions will be so inconvenient because they also affect assets abroad. They affect their ability to go to their villas, you know, in the south of France, and their children to go to school abroad. Hopefully it'll make life very uncomfortable, but that will take some time. They have, however, lost collectively about $32 billion in personal assets in the last 3 or 4 days. The ruble has dropped by about 27%. Russia has a run on the banks inside. There were long lines for ATMs. The Russians are now isolated. And over the last 30 years, they've modernized. And people your age don't want to be isolated. They like their iPhones, right? They want to be connected to the world. Well, now you can't fly in or out of Russia over European or Canadian or, okay, I am Canadian. But the reason I mention it is you have to go over the polar ice cap to get to North America from a lot of places in Russia. So, you know, hopefully this will be enough to bring people out on the streets. We're beginning to see petitions circulated. There was one human rights, well, really sort of a very high stature human rights organizer, Lev Ponomaryov, through change.org, got a petition that demanded an immediate ceasefire and the return of the Russian military to Russia, 1 million signatures in about 24 hours. We're seeing some celebrities in Russia speak out against the world, and we're seeing hints even of some very rich people like Abramovich and others indicating that they're uncomfortable with this. So with any luck, that will bring people out onto the streets, but it's very dangerous to protest in Russia. You can be arrested. Even if you come back out after that, you might lose your job or your place in school. And so the risk is high. People have to be brave to do it. But hopefully Putin will begin to feel the pressure of his own orange revolution, ironically. And this could, with any, you know, this could be the end of him over time. But we'll have to see. We're pretty early days.
I'm going to ask one question of all of you and take a minute or two, because one thing that none of you covered was your thoughts on why Putin is doing this and what is he really thinking. When you have a personalist dictatorship, people tend to surround themselves with yes men, and it's scary, and opposition can't say things that they might others, and even military people may fear that it's inappropriate to trust that you can have a checks and balances system. You go on a nuclear alert in an unprovoked manner. When you call the Ukrainian government drug addicted Nazis, when you say that there's going to be a walkover and they'll treat us as liberators, this could all be two different things. One is a really clever bargaining strategy of trying to say you're acting this way in order to get people to back down. The other is that you really believe it and that no one can tell you otherwise. So I'd like you to just each say a word or two about whether you think which of those two possibilities you think is more likely. And is there anything in what you've talked about that could give us clues about what he's actually thinking and whether anybody has said anything to oppose his line of thinking? Rose, we'll go down the line.
Right. So this is like your two, what's driving Putin. The two scenarios, one I call the crazy like a fox scenario, right? That he's doing everything to drive the negotiations in his direction. And the second is, this is his belief system. And I think Kathryn actually did talk about this. And there are some really good articles just in the last couple of days, pretty daring, some of them from Russian people, talking about this notion of the Anglo-Saxon West is ready to crack. It's on the downward trajectory. And this is the time, if I'm going to have a role in history, this is the time to reassert Great Russia. And if I don't do it, then Ukraine may be lost forever. So I've become convinced that over the last, since the invasion started, that this is not a crazy like a fox driving the negotiations to the far extent of what he wants. I'm convinced this is his belief system, and that is what is driving him. And that is dangerous, I think, because surrounded by yes men as he is, he's not getting any other opinions coming at him.
I know you said something about it, but you say more, Kathryn.
So I don't think it's a bargaining strategy because he wouldn't bargain earlier. Again, you don't just come up with 190,000 troops and all of their equipment on the spur of the moment, right? So a lot of planning has gone into this. And I do think that he has come to believe this. So he's been, in isolation over the last 2 years because of COVID. And I think you're probably referring to Sasha.
I don't remember his last name.
Right, Gottemoeller. Right, there's a great little piece that came out a week ago in the, this is my little piece, signal, I guess, in The Economist by Alexander, I think it's Gunaev from Carnegie, that I think beautifully explains this. So the last 2 years, Putin has been more or less alone at one or the other of his residences and in quarantine, quite nervous about COVID. And this you can see in pictures of him and Macron at opposite ends of the table today. It was him and his four members of the sort of power ministries at the far end of the table. And there he is, like 20 feet away, as far as I am from this camera almost. So apparently to see him, you had to test negative. You had to quarantine 2 weeks, test negative, and then go through a tunnel and be sprayed by disinfectant. And then you could visit with him from 40 feet away. So who has done that, taken the trouble to do it? Well, the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, is the only guy who's allowed to score goals in Putin's hockey games on his birthday. Which says, we used to look at Lenin, who is close to the General Secretary on Lenin's mausoleum, and now it's hockey games who's allowed to score. The second is Patrushev, who's the head of the Security Council. The third is this guy Borodnikov, who's the head of the internal security. And then the fourth is Narishkin, who he humiliated on TV because he got his lines wrong last Tuesday, who's head of the exterior ministry or foreign security, foreign intelligence. They're all about the same age, 68, 69 years old, really defined by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not that they want communism back, but they want empire back. And so there's often this quote from Putin that people remember the first line, but not the second, which is, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest strategic catastrophe of the 20th century. But then the line goes on, but if you want it back, you have no head. If you don't miss it, you have no heart. And so, he has this perception that there is a greater Russia and that, again, Ukrainian people need to be saved from the West that has created this corrupt, drug-addicted government and filled them with ideas of Anglo-Saxon ideas of democracy, and so they must be brought back. So it's not at all about NATO. Notice how few of us have mentioned NATO expansion. Just remember, like, NATO hasn't expanded to Russia's borders until 2004, since 2004, and that's in the Baltics, as Andriy mentioned.
Well, could I just mention very briefly, and the bizarre thing is NATO has been on Russia's borders since it was founded, practically.
Yeah.
Norway is
Right,
on
right,
on
yes.
Russia's border. So
Yeah, so it's not about that. It's about Ukraine, which he views as a part of Russia, trying to go too far to the West. And so actually Zelensky's move today to try to sign a request to join the European Union was quite masterful, because that'll drive Putin nuts, nuttier, let me put it that way. So I think that's what it is, Scott, in a very short.
Yeah, I think there are two aspects to Putin's concern now about Ukraine. One is geopolitical, as Kathryn mentioned. It's that from his perspective now, it looks like Ukraine is on the verge of being irretrievably lost. It's moving away from Russia, it's moving to the West. Now, I would argue that the biggest single factor pushing Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West and towards institutions such as NATO is Russian policy over the last 8 years. But the second factor, which is as and perhaps even more important, is this concern, I believe, in the Kremlin, that a successful Ukraine, a westward-oriented, democratic market economy with a robust economy Ukraine, that's a threat to the Kremlin. Because that kind of Ukraine gets the Russian people to say, why can't we have the same kind of democracy that they have in Ukraine? So it's not just about geopolitics, it's also about regime legitimacy in Russia and even regime survival. The question, does Putin believe his narratives? This goes back a long time. If you go back to the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, Putin's consistent explanation was, this is not a manifestation of popular discontent with a stolen election. This is organized by the CIA, MI6, and German intelligence. And that's been the story behind any public display in any of the color revolutions that took place. And he says it so much, you begin to think, yeah, he actually is believing it. Just a couple of other points. I think Putin he likes working in a small circle. He has that inner circle. I think he likes working a bit alone. I recall when he was the prime minister, because briefly he stepped down in 2008 because under the Russian constitution at the time, you could only serve 2 consecutive terms as president. So he basically swapped jobs with his prime minister. Dmitry Medvedev became president, he became prime minister. But one of the officials in the Kremlin said, Putin actually kind of likes one aspect about this prime minister is he doesn't have to meet so many people. He can kind of work alone. So this is somebody who I think is inclined to work by himself. And I do worry that the isolation that he has in that inner circle has been even more constrained in the last 2 years. Because from my perspective, I think he's actually paranoid about COVID. I mean, these bizarre pictures that we saw yesterday where he's 25 feet away from his Minister of Defense and the chief of his general staff, both of whom I'm sure to get in the room had to have been vaccinated, but they're still way at that angle. And I guess the last comment I would make is, I think there has been a change in Putin over the last, this is not the Putin that we were dealing with 15, 20 years ago. I think part of it is he has become more emotional, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. There's emotion there. And he's not quite the calculating person who sort of looks at costs and benefits and says, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I think that's clouded. And I think that is leading him to make mistakes. I think there's another aspect to this about Putin is that he's prone to miscalculation now. He's taking risks that he did not take before. I mean, this is a huge risk going into Ukraine, both in terms of a possible, and I very much hope for a military failure, but also the big risk of what does that do to the Russian domestic opinion with regards to the Kremlin. And so this is a different Putin we have to worry about than before.
Yeah, I agree with all what was said, but I also want to mention another two factors. As for me, it's also crucial when we're talking about what really happens in the head of this old crazy man. And of course, first of all, we need to remember their origin. They are from KGB. It's a Cheka root. They believe that that the world based on the what we call conspiracy theory, that no one people or ordinary people cannot change nothing. So ordinary people, it's like a zero, but the huge powers moving of all, it's West, Anglo-Saxon, I don't know. And of course, he arrived in this frame of how they understand world. Another also strong connection with the KGB. KGB create in Soviet Union some kind of myth of the secret police, secret services, that they under all, they extremely smart, incredibly smart, like black bear in Sierra Nevada, that I don't know, because if you're moving like mountains, you'll see this tablet with a black bear and incredibly smart. Okay, no. So they believe that they like these Chekists, or they incredibly smart. They can calculate everything. But another factor is what's very important. It's typical mistake of all dictators who very broad use two measures. It's like censorship and propaganda. They create some imagine and believe to imagine what they create to their domestic use. And of course, all these soldiers, all these invaders who come into Ukraine, they believe that it's like some tour to the Kyiv. They coming to Maidan, to Independence Square, to Dnieper River. It's like a funny, but it's a lack of independent analysis. It's a lack of real analysis what happens. So they live in some kind, it's very weird, quasi-ideological understanding what is world is. And of course, if you try to understand what Putin says, it's very close to different quasi-philosophical schools in Russia. It's like a mix of orthodoxy, Russia Empire, some kind of Soviet Union's kinds. It's like very strange and irrational understanding what world is, what society is, and what human being is. And of course, it's a lack of adequate understanding, and so it's lack of independence. So it's a lack of critique. If we're talking about our part of world, if you're discussing with someone, it doesn't matter with whom, it's possibility to check what you think and how you think. They artificially create situations that he loses this possibility, and of course, it's like the huge mistake and miscalculation, of course. And their decision is like lose-lose decision.
Our panel has agreed to go to 6:15, so to get a question or two from the audience. And we have a microphone for the people. Bring out the microphone. If you could introduce yourself very briefly.
We can keep questions short. Who's going to start from the front?
And I called.
Hi, I'm Kathryn Miller. I'm a visiting scholar here at CISAC. I wanted to raise a topic that the group hasn't talked about yet, and that's the cyber dimension of the conflict. I've been particularly struck by reports of non-state groups like Anonymous reportedly declaring cyber war on Russia. So I was wondering if anyone on the panel can comment on how you view the cyber dimension and how might impact the trajectory of this?
May I start? Or do you want to take a couple questions?
Go ahead.
No, I've been fascinated by this, Karen, and I will welcome my colleagues who are more cyber experts, but I think frankly, and I'm thinking about this with my NATO hat on, throughout the time I was Deputy Secretary General, the Russians were like 10 feet tall in hybrid space, right? 10 feet tall, not only with regard to their cyber attack tactics, but also with regard to their misinformation tactics. And now we're seeing in this war that the Russians are not 10 feet tall, either in cyberspace nor in the misinformation space. In fact, I would say at the current time, the Ukrainian people and those supporting them are winning the information war at this moment. So I think this is a very interesting development, and it's going to be very helpful, I think, for NATO going forward as they continue to grapple with how to contest in cyberspace, how to contest hybrid threats overall. But I think it is quite an interesting phenomenon, and something that we here at Stanford are going to need to study.
Steve.
Also, just second, I mean, I think the Russians are definitely losing the information war, and it's not just vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, but vis-a-vis the West. It was interesting that when Putin gave his lengthy speech on Monday of last week, which was not just explanation of recognition of these two little so-called people's republics, but it really was the case for the war that he unleashed on Thursday. But there was really no pretext for this. I mean, and that was, I think, an advantage taken away from him by a Western information campaign that pretty much discounted this pretext in advance. So I think actually Moscow is losing this information war, and that's a very good thing. I guess the one thing that surprises me, though, is I would have expected, and there have been some Russian cyber attacks against Ukraine, but not to the extent that I think we would have expected. And so I wonder, is that the result of a choice that they made in Moscow, or is that a result that perhaps some of their cyber capabilities may not be as strong as we thought?
Or that they are undergoing massive attacks themselves, which are including these attacks from non-government hackers and so forth.
Can I say one quick thing about Anonymous? So they claim that they hacked into Russian television and broadcast briefly on 4 or 5 Russian TV channels, and they actually showed the schedule and then showed clips that ran for a few minutes trying to tell the Russian people that this is, you're being lied to, this is an invasion, they're killing Ukrainians. I can't confirm that happened. I just, that's something they have claimed. But they have shut down a number of websites and, briefly at least, including the Ministry of Defense. And then the Ukrainian government has, President Zelensky has got a group of cyber warriors. Ukraine has some pretty significant IT capabilities too. So this may also explain why that some of the attacks Russia might want to do are blunted. Sorry, Andriy.
Andriy, okay, thanks. I think that I hope that those smart guy from Anonymous understands that the war Putin against whole world, it's war with freedom. It's like they live in the frame of unfreedom world where you cannot be free. And also when we're talking about internet, when we're talking about cyberspace, it's a question of diversity. How many diversity? It's much more better situation for further development. And of course, when this Russia empire come back, it means that only one people can decide what happens and how. Only Tsar, that's all. And of course, it's like, I want to believe that it's also struggle not for justice, but struggle for their own further development, for their own right to be those people what he wants to be.
Question in the front. You identify yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Nariman Ustayev, visiting fellow Ukrainian Emerging Leaders Program. Do you know what Ukrainians say about Russian troops right now? Between Kyiv and that. So I believe the whole world is waiting for the message. Putin is dead. It will create a lot of opportunities for many countries, from Georgia to Japan. Entrepreneurs, maybe China, benefits as well. But what if he is not? Not right now. Is current Western Union enough to stop Putin war in Ukraine and to stop Putin's further aggressive
ask that question, Alexei, is if
Andriy.
Andriy, if Kyiv does fall and the government flees, how fierce will the insurrection be against a puppet government that's put in?
Fierce.
Explain.
I think that so if you can saw what happens today in Ukraine, it's last 5 days. As for me, it's clearly understand that if Russia creates some puppet regime in some, I don't know, Kharkiv or Ochtyrka or something else, or Kherson, in our 100 the past history, we have situation when also Russia Bolsheviks create puppet regime in Voronezh. So it's nothing new for us, unfortunately. And the Soviet Ukraine Russia attack from this puppet regime in Voronezh, not from Kharkiv, not from Kyiv or other city. So it's not question about if they create puppet regime or not. Main question, if Ukrainian will be struggle against unfreedom or not. And what you can see today in your screen, we struggle, and we will struggle to the win.
And I think that's the dilemma for the Russians. I mean, they can't create a credible puppet government unless they take down the existing legitimate government. And I would say that, and Andriy, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you had a puppet government in Kyiv, it lasts about 2 minutes after the Russian military leaves. So even if the Russian military wins, and I put that in quotation marks, and they do install a pro-Russian government, it means that the Russian military and Russian security forces are going to have to be carrying out for a long time to come an occupation of Ukraine, dealing with this resistance, which could mean a regular flow of dead Russian soldiers going home.
In 20 centuries, so in 20 centuries in Western Ukraine and Central Ukraine, without any support from West or other countries, Ukrainians insurgency exists more than dozen years. So today, when we have support, and we very thanks to our partner in United States, in the European Union, today it will be, I don't know, for eternity. When Russia will be exist, we struggle with them.
Well, we have a student right here with the Houston Rockets shirt.
I'm Sam Siegel. I'm a history undergraduate. My question kind of concerns the last question is, where do we see this going? We see it within, I know Putin said that he doesn't intend to occupy it, but we see that this is going to result in an occupation, a partition, a control of just the, eastern half of Ukraine, or this is the kind of likely scenario. And if Putin did kind of want to reverse course, how would he do it?
So, Sam, great question. We're all guessing, right? But I mean, what I see in the Russian press and what he's more or less told us is, and I'm now starting, when a person shows you who they are, believe them. I think we can believe him now, is that this is a sort of messianic thing, and that what he is doing here, is he has lifted from successive generations the burden of having to reunite. And that's the goal, and to put in a government that is friendly to Russia and to retrain Ukrainians, reprogram them, right? And basically, or deprogram them and get this idea about democracy and liberalism out of their heads. What might happen is some sort of partition, maybe, but I don't think that's the goal. And unfortunately, given, again, you don't put that amount of firepower to look for on the borders and plan it this far in advance. I mean, remember, we first saw this buildup starting in April, actually, of last year. So I just for, to partition off. Now, last week, I would have said scenario 1, partition a third of the country. Scenario 2, take it all. Now I think it's just scenario 2. Yeah, it's existential for him. at this point, as Steve said, starting to see a little popular disapproval. And it could be that, something happens to him, maybe not. But
From the one behind, sir.
So there's been some pushback, and there have been people out on the streets protesting at great personal risk. There have been significant arrests. Initially, there were protests of one size or another, some very big in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. But, as I said, he's been preparing for this for a while. So they already had, the National Guard and Oman, the security forces out even before, they were arriving even before protesters in some places, and they're hauling off little kids, right? I mean, they'll haul off a teenager, they'll haul off an older woman. I saw a woman with, baby Bjorn and a baby in front, and, address her too, arrest her too. So this will dissuade people from coming out on the streets. But just before I came here, I was looking at the Russian press again, and I know that like one district of Moscow, the district council there is condemning the invasion. Even Putin's spokesman's daughter briefly had on her Instagram, "No war," and then she took it down quickly. She's 24. So I think what you will start seeing more out on the streets, especially, imagine suddenly you go to the bank and there's no money. You try to buy something that you wanted, like an iPhone, and instead of costing, $500, it suddenly costs $750. This will begin to irritate people who are already seeing the real income start to drop. And remember, Russians aren't incapable of mobilizing. When Navalny was being put in jail last year, there were huge protests. They had huge protests in 2011, 2012. So, that's quite possible. And as again, we're starting to see some rumbling out of some of the very wealthy people who can't access their assets. But imagine suddenly not being able to leave, basically, because there are no flights out of the country.
Yeah, I think there's also a couple other factors at play here. Remember, Russian state television, from what they've told the Russian population, if you're watching only state TV, these are military operations that are really confined to around Donbass. They're not saying that we have, in fact, you're now prohibited, I think, in the Russian press from saying invasion or war, special military operation.
You can only use the Russian press as your sources.
Yeah. So that's problem number one. But problem number two is, and it was only yesterday the Ministry of Defense admitted that in these special military operations, there have been casualties. Now, at some point, I mean, I think the Ukrainians have claimed that they've killed 4,500 Russians to date. My guess is that's exaggerated. But if you look at the destroyed vehicles, I think it's safe to say hundreds of Russians have died so far.
And also the internet's open, right? You don't need a VPN. You can go and find this stuff.
Yeah, they can't hide that forever. The Ukrainians are being quite smart. This may be, I think, bending the rules of how you have to treat prisoners, but they're giving Russian prisoners cell phones and saying, call your mom, tell them where you are. Tell them what happened to your friends who aren't here with you because they were in that APC that took a hit from a javelin. So I think the word's going to get out. And as it'll be interesting to see, I mean, I don't know how the reaction, but it's going to be interesting what the Russian people do when they begin to understand, that it's not just I can't get money, but it's like, my son's not coming home.
If we compare the level of defeat, for example, of course, today it's very hard to count it, what scale of defeat, because it's very dynamic situation. It's a central and eastern and south part of Ukraine. But according to the information from Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, they counted that around 5,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers, was killed. And for compare what it's mean for Russia or Soviet Union, for example, during Afghan war, 10 years, the Soviet Union was killed approximately 15,000 of soldiers. So one set of those who was killed in Afghan for 10 years was killed in Ukraine for 5 days. It's for understanding what now happens in Ukraine.
I'll just make one additional remark here, and that is there was I keep using the word egregious, but there was an egregious lack of preparation for this operation. They have apparently sent the troops in with 3 days of food because they said this is going to be a blitzkrieg now. They're up to 5 days. They're out of food and fuel. Ukrainians are also, suffering now because they don't have adequate means to restock supermarkets and all that kind of thing. So I think it really is a very serious issue for the Russian armed forces, and morale already, low is bound to go lower.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, and I just wanted to say that these conversations are sobering, but they're also insightful and inspiring in other ways as well. And so please join me in thanking Kathryn and Alexei Rose.